Welcome to Secret Channel, where chilling ghost stories and mysteries take you into the realm of the unknown. Are you ready to face the darkness? Story 1. The reincarnation of the drowned. From the moment he was old enough to speak, my younger brother, Lucas, had an unshakable fear of water. He would scream and cry every time bath time rolled around, clutching the edges of the bathtub as though it were a life or death struggle. As his older sibling, 4 years his senior, I found his terror perplexing. After all, as my mother always said, Lucas had loved water as a baby, splashing happily in his little tub. What could have changed? One night, when Lucas was about 4 years old, the nightly battle over bath time took a strange and chilling turn. Exhausted by his relentless resistance, I decided to ask him why he was so afraid. His big, teary eyes locked onto mine, and in a voice that sounded far too mature for his age, he whispered, "I was on a big ship. It was unsinkable. But then we hit an iceberg and everything went wrong." My skin prickled. "What happened next?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Lucas looked down, his small hands trembling. There was water everywhere. It was so cold. People were screaming. I couldn't breathe. And then it got quiet. I was in a bright, warm place, waiting for my family to find me. His words sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't just describing fear. He was recounting an experience, a memory. But how could a 4-year-old know such details? My mother overheard the conversation and froze. She asked Lucas to repeat himself, and he did, word for word. The room fell silent as we exchanged uneasy glances. That night, after Lucas had finally fallen asleep, my mother did some research. The words unsinkable ship and iceberg brought her to the tragic story of the RMS Titanic. Then she discovered something even more unsettling. Lucas was born on April 15th, 1992. Exactly 80 years to the day after the Titanic sank on April 15th, 1912. "It's just a coincidence," my father said, though his voice lacked conviction. But my mother wasn't convinced. She began to notice other strange behaviors. Lucas would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, shouting about water and ice. He refused to go near pools or beaches. And once, while watching a documentary about the Titanic, he pointed to the screen and said, "That's it. That's where I died." As Lucas grew older, his fear didn't fade. Instead, it evolved. He began to have vivid nightmares, always the same. Icy water rushing in, the sound of metal groaning and breaking, people crying out for help. He would wake up drenched in sweat, shaking and sobbing. "They were screaming," he told me one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "They were trying to hold on to me, but I slipped away." The way he described it was so detailed, so visceral, that it was hard to dismiss as a child's imagination. He spoke of lifeboats, freezing hands clutching at railings, and the eerie silence that followed once the ship had vanished beneath the waves. My mother, desperate for answers, took Lucas to a therapist. But the therapist's attempts to rationalize his fears only seemed to make things worse. Lucas began drawing pictures of the Titanic in painstaking detail, drawings far too accurate for a boy his age. And in every image, he included a figure that he claimed was himself, standing on the deck as the ship went down. One day, my mother reached out to a hypnotherapist who specialized in past life regression. At first, my father protested, dismissing the idea as nonsense. But after one particularly harrowing night when Lucas woke up screaming about the ice, he reluctantly agreed. During the session, the hypnotherapist guided Lucas into a trance. What followed was both fascinating and horrifying. Lucas began to speak in a calm, detached voice, recounting a life that wasn't his own. He described himself as a young boy named Henry, traveling with his mother and sister aboard the Titanic. "It was so beautiful," he said, his small hands gesturing as he spoke. "The chandeliers, the music, the big staircase. But then his tone darkened. I heard a loud crash. People started running. My mother told me to stay with her, but I got separated. There was water everywhere. It was so cold. I tried to hold onto the railing, but the ship was tilting. I fell, and then everything went black. Tears streamed down his face as he spoke. My mother and I sat frozen, unable to process what we were hearing. When the session ended, the hypnotherapist looked pale. I've seen cases of past life memories before, she said, but this is something else. After the session, strange things began happening in our house. At night, we would hear faint sounds of rushing water, even though no faucets were running. Lucas's bedroom would often be freezing cold, no matter how high the thermostat was set. And once, my mother found a puddle of water on the floor outside his door, though there was no leak to be found. Lucas, too, seemed different. He became quieter, more withdrawn, as though the weight of his memories was too much to bear. He stopped drawing pictures and refused to talk about the Titanic. But the nightmares continued, and they grew more vivid. One night, he woke up screaming louder than ever before. When I rushed into his room, he was sitting bolt upright, his eyes wide with terror. "They're still there," he said, clutching my arm. "The people in the water. They're calling for me. They won't let me go." The haunting reached its peak on the night of Lucas's 10th birthday. As the clock struck midnight, the house was plunged into darkness. The power outage seemed localized to our home, as the streetlights outside remained lit. My parents and I lit candles and checked on Lucas, who was fast asleep. But then we heard it. The unmistakable sound of a ship's horn, low and mournful, echoing through the house. It was followed by the sound of footsteps, wet and heavy, making their way down the hallway. My father grabbed a flashlight and opened Lucas's door, but the room was empty. The bed was soaked, as though someone had dragged him into the ocean. We found Lucas outside, standing in the backyard, staring up at the night sky. His lips were blue, and his breath formed clouds in the cold air. "They're here," he said, his voice distant. "They've come for me." We rushed him inside and wrapped him in blankets, but he refused to speak another word. The next morning, he seemed fine, as though nothing had happened. But my parents and I knew the truth. Something beyond our understanding had touched him that night. Lucas eventually grew out of his fear of water, but the memories of that time lingered like shadows. Even now, as an adult, he avoids the ocean and refuses to talk about the Titanic. But every year, on April 15th, he lights a candle and places it by the window, a silent tribute to the life he lost, and the one he lives now. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear it. The faint sound of rushing water and the distant echo of a ship's horn, haunting us like a ghost from the deep. Story 2. Dancing down an Indian hallway in darkness. I never believed in ghost stories until I heard the tale from my cousin, Asha. She had recently moved to the US from Secunderabad, India, and was staying with my family. One evening, as we sat together, I curiously asked if she had ever experienced anything supernatural in her homeland. For a long moment, she remained silent, her eyes distant as if reliving a nightmare. Just when I thought she wouldn't answer, Asha nodded, her voice trembling. "Yes, one memory I will never forget." Asha began her story. Back in college, she had lived in an all-girls dormitory on campus. The building was old, surrounded by dense woods, and its weathered walls bore the marks of time. "It was wonderful living there with friends," she said, "but there was always an unshakable coldness about the place. The dorm had one unwritten rule: never walk down the hallway alone at night. No one ever explained why, but everyone followed it." The hallway stretched long and narrow, dimly lit with sporadic bulbs, and the windows were boarded up by the caretaker, who always muttered warnings about something lurking in the darkness. One night, Asha woke up around 4 a.m. She needed to use the restroom, located at the end of the hallway. Instead of going alone, she decided to wake her roommate. But when she touched her friend's shoulder, a chill ran up her arm. Her roommate's skin was icy cold. Despite this, her breathing was calm and steady, as if she was in a deep sleep. Not wanting to disturb her, Asha decided to venture out alone. The hallway was eerily silent, the faint flicker of light bulbs casting long, wavering shadows. As she passed the third door, she heard it. A soft knock, coming from somewhere behind her. She froze and turned around, but the hallway behind her was empty. Brushing it off as her imagination, she continued walking, but the knock came again, louder this time. It sounded like footsteps. No, like someone tapping rhythmically on the floor, almost as if dancing. Her heartbeat quickened, and she hastened her pace. Just as she reached the restroom, the final light bulb at the end of the hallway began to flicker and then went out completely, plunging her into darkness. In the suffocating darkness, Asha could hear footsteps. Not the steady sound of someone walking, but an erratic, frantic rhythm, like someone performing a twisted dance. A cold draft swept past her, and then she saw it. A figure appeared faintly in the flickering light of a malfunctioning bulb. It was a woman, draped in a white sari, her long hair cascading down to cover her face. Her body didn't move naturally. It swayed and jerked as if controlled by invisible strings, her movements grotesque and unsettling. When the woman lifted her head, Asha's blood ran cold. Her face was ghastly pale, her eyes empty hollows, and her mouth stretched into an unnaturally wide grin. The air filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of her jerky movements. Asha wanted to scream, but fear choked her. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing wildly as she fled back to her room. Slamming the door shut, she found her roommate still lying in bed, motionless. But when she got closer, she noticed something horrifying. Her roommate's skin was unnaturally pale, and her lips were twisted into the same sinister grin as the figure in the hallway. The next morning, the dormitory was in chaos. A girl from another room had been found hanging in her closet. The whispers spread quickly. She had taken her own life, but the most chilling detail was her expression. Even in death, her face bore that same haunting grin. When Asha learned that the girl had died at 11:30 p.m., almost 5 hours before Asha's encounter in the hallway, she couldn't shake the feeling that the events were connected. The image of the dancing woman and the twisted grin stayed with her, an indelible scar on her memory. Asha never returned to that dormitory. Even after moving away, she confessed that the memories of that night followed her. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear the faint sound of footsteps, that same erratic, haunting rhythm. And in her dreams, she would see the woman in white dancing silently in the darkness. Her story left me shaken. I couldn't forget the fear in her voice as she recounted the events. Some places, I realized, hold secrets too dark for anyone to uncover, and some memories never fade, no matter how far you run. Story 3. The Crying Woman. A Legend. Reborn. The night was pitch black, with the moon hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. Tom, a traveling salesman, was driving down a desolate road that cut through the heart of a dense forest. The only sounds were the hum of his car engine and the occasional rustling of leaves carried by the wind. The clock on his dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and fatigue was setting in. As he rounded a bend, he heard it. A faint sobbing carried by the wind seemed to come from the woods to his left. At first, he thought it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But as he drove further, the sound grew louder, more desperate. He slowed the car, peering into the darkness beyond the road. That's when he saw her. A woman dressed in a flowing white gown stood just beyond the tree line. Her long black hair obscured her face, and her shoulders shook with each agonized cry. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories of ghostly apparitions on lonely roads, but this seemed different. She looked too real, too human to be a mere specter. Concerned, Tom pulled over and got out of the car. "Are you all right?" he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. The woman's sobbing stopped abruptly. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her face was pale, almost luminescent in the darkness. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and her lips quivered as she whispered, "My children. I can't find them. Please help me." Tom's heart ached for her. "What happened? Where did you last see them?" he asked, stepping closer. But as he neared, something changed. Her features twisted, her sorrow morphing into something far more sinister. Her eyes became hollow voids, and her mouth stretched unnaturally wide as if screaming, though no sound escaped. Before Tom could react, the woman vanished, leaving behind only the echo of her cries and an icy chill in the air. Shaken, he stumbled back to his car and sped away, his mind racing. Who was she? And where had she gone? The next morning, Tom arrived in the nearest town, still haunted by the events of the previous night. He stopped at a diner to grab a coffee and gather his thoughts. As he recounted his encounter to the waitress, her expression changed from curiosity to dread. "You've met La Llorona," she said in a hushed tone. "The weeping woman. She's a legend around here." Tom leaned in, intrigued and uneasy. "Who is she?" The waitress glanced around, as if fearing someone might overhear. "They say she was a mother who drowned her own children in a fit of rage centuries ago. When she realized what she had done, she was consumed by grief and threw herself into the river. Now her spirit wanders, crying for her lost children and luring unsuspecting souls to their doom." Tom felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The woman he had seen couldn't have been real, could she? Days turned into weeks, but Tom couldn't shake the memory of La Llorona. Her cries echoed in his dreams, and her hollow eyes haunted his waking moments. He began researching the legend, digging through old books and online forums. The more he learned, the more obsessed he became. He discovered countless tales of encounters with the weeping woman, each more chilling than the last. Some described hearing her cries near rivers or lakes, while others claimed she had appeared to them on lonely roads, just as she had to Tom. And in every story, those who saw her were marked. Accidents, deaths, and disappearances followed in her wake. Tom tried to dismiss these stories as mere superstition, but strange things began happening. Lights flickered in his apartment, and he often felt a cold presence watching him. One night, he awoke to the sound of sobbing coming from outside his window. When he looked out, there was no one there. Determined to confront his fears, Tom decided to return to the forest where he had first seen her. He arrived just before sunset, parking his car near the bend in the road. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. As darkness fell, he heard it again, the same mournful cries that had haunted him for weeks. He followed the sound, flashlight in hand, deeper into the woods. The sobbing grew louder, leading him to a riverbank shrouded in mist. There she was, standing in the water, her white gown billowing around her. This time she didn't cry. She turned to face him, her expression blank, but her eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice like the rustling of leaves. Tom swallowed his fear. "I want to help you. I want to understand." She tilted her head, studying him. "You cannot help me," she said, her voice growing colder. "But you can join me." Before Tom could react, the river surged, and shadowy hands reached out from the water, grasping at his legs. He tried to run, but the hands pulled him down, the icy water filling his lungs. The last thing he saw was La Llorona's face, her hollow eyes staring into his soul. Tom's car was found abandoned the next morning, his belongings still inside. The townsfolk whispered about his fate, adding his name to the long list of those claimed by La Llorona. But the river was silent, and the forest remained still. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, some swore they could hear a man's voice mingling with the cries of the weeping woman, forever bound to her sorrowful legend. Story 4. The Basement's Whisper. "Never go into the basement," my mother said, her voice firm and her gaze stern. She had repeated this rule to me so many times that I could recite it in my sleep. "It's not safe down there," she would add, leaving no room for questions. And yet, she never explained why. But that day, that one cursed day, I couldn't resist. It was late afternoon. The sun's golden rays filtered through the window, but the house felt unusually quiet. That's when I heard it. A faint whimper, like a puppy crying for help. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound came again, this time louder. It was coming from the basement. A mixture of curiosity and concern gripped me. We didn't own a dog, so where was that sound coming from? My mother was out running errands, and the house was empty. It was the perfect opportunity to satisfy my curiosity. I tiptoed to the basement door, my small hands trembling as I reached for the knob. It felt cold to the touch. Slowly, I turned it, the creaking hinges sounding like a warning. Beyond the doorway, a set of wooden stairs descended into darkness. The air that wafted up smelled damp and metallic, like rust and old water. The whimpering continued, more desperate now. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. But the thought of a helpless puppy needing my help pushed me forward. I stepped onto the first stair, then another, each creak echoing in the stillness. The further I descended, the colder it became. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I rubbed my arms to ward off the chill. The dim light from the open doorway above barely reached me. I squinted, trying to make out shapes in the gloom. The basement was larger than I expected, its corners swallowed by shadows. "Here, puppy?" I called softly, my voice trembling. The whimpering stopped. The sudden silence was oppressive, pressing against my ears like a heavy weight. My heart sank. Had I scared it away? That's when I heard something else. A soft shuffling, like bare feet dragging across concrete. My stomach knotted as I strained to see. From the farthest corner of the basement, a figure began to emerge. At first, I thought it was a child, about my size. But as it moved closer, I realized something was terribly wrong. Its arms and legs were grotesquely bent, the limbs ending in stumps where hands and feet should have been. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the faint light around them. I froze, unable to scream, unable to move. The thing shuffled closer, its head twitching with unnatural jerks. Then it opened its mouth, a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth, and let out a sound that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't a cry or a growl. It was a mimicry of a puppy's whimper, distorted and wrong. Stares, the creatures. Before I could react, a pair of strong hands grabbed me from behind. I was yanked up the whimpering howl following us as the basement door slammed shut. I turned to see my mother, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She had never looked so frightened. "What did I tell you?" she shouted, shaking me by the shoulders. "Never go into the basement, never." I burst into tears, partly from terror and partly from guilt. I thought there was a puppy," I stammered. My mother's expression softened, but her fear didn't fade. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "It's not safe. Never go down there again." That night, I lay awake in bed, haunted by the image of the creature. I wanted to ask my mother what it was, but something about her silence told me she wouldn't answer. Instead, she baked cookies for me and tried to distract me with games and stories. But the fear lingered, and so did the sound of that distorted whimpering. Weeks passed, but the memory of that day refused to fade. My mother avoided the basement altogether, locking the door and keeping the key with her at all times. But the sounds didn't stop. Late at night, when the house was silent, I could hear it. The faint shuffling, the eerie mimicry of a puppy's cries. Sometimes it was accompanied by faint scratching at the basement door. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I crept out of bed and tiptoed to my mother's room, where I found the key hidden in her jewelry box. My hands trembled as I unlocked the basement door, the familiar cold air brushing against my face. This time, I brought a flashlight. Its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the stairs as I descended once more. The air felt heavier, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of my own breathing. At the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A series of crude drawings etched into the concrete walls. They depicted twisted figures, much like the creature I had seen, surrounded by what looked like smaller, human-like shapes. Beneath the drawings were words scratched into the stone. "They hunger. They wait." My flashlight flickered, and the air grew colder. I turned, and there it was again. The creature. But this time, it wasn't alone. Several others emerged from the shadows, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their twisted forms blocking the stairs. I was trapped. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The creatures advanced, their distorted whimpers filling the air. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for anything I could use to defend myself. My hand brushed against something cold and metallic, an old pipe lying on the ground. Gripping it tightly, I swung at the nearest creature. The pipe connected with a sickening crunch, and the thing let out a high-pitched screech before dissolving into a puddle of dark, viscous liquid. The others hesitated, their heads tilting as if in confusion. Taking advantage of their pause, I bolted for the stairs. My legs burned as I scrambled upward, the creature's distorted cries echoing behind me. I burst through the door and slammed it shut, locking it just as something heavy slammed against the other side. My mother was waiting, her face pale and tear-streaked. Without a word, she took the key from my trembling hands and threw it into the fireplace. The flames consumed it, and for the first time, the house fell silent. She sat me down and finally told me the truth. The basement had been there long before the house was built. It was a place where something ancient and malevolent had been trapped. Over the years, it had lured people with its mimicry, feeding on their fear and despair. My mother had inherited the house and its curse, and she had done everything in her power to keep me safe. We moved out soon after, leaving the house and its horrors behind. But even now, years later, I can still hear it sometimes. That faint, distorted whimper. It follows me in my dreams, a chilling reminder of what lies beneath. And I know, deep down, that the basement door is still there, waiting for someone else to open it. Story 5. The Sleepless House. Alex was an unemployed writer feeling utterly disillusioned with life. He had once been a notable name in the publishing world, but in recent years, his work had grown lackluster and failed to capture readers. Determined to turn things around, Alex decided to venture into writing a horror novel, a genre he had never attempted before. Through a friend's recommendation, Alex learned about the Dark House, located in a desolate mountain region. The house had been abandoned for decades, shrouded in eerie legends. According to rumors, anyone who had ever stepped foot inside the house had never returned. The evening Alex arrived, a thick mist enveloped the entire area. The house loomed in the distance, its jagged silhouette emerging from the fog like a colossal ghost. The rusty gate creaked ominously as Alex pushed it open, almost as if issuing a warning. On his first night, Alex began to notice strange occurrences within the house. After setting up his writing desk, he sat down and began typing the opening lines of his novel. The clattering of his keyboard echoed in the stillness, but outside, a faint knock disturbed the quiet. Knock, knock, knock. Alex froze mid-sentence. Turning toward the door, his heart raced. Probably just the wind, he muttered to himself, attempting to stay calm. But as he turned back to his desk, a faint whisper filled the air. "Don't write about us." Alex shivered, spinning around. The doorway was empty, but from the staircase came the faint creak of footsteps descending, as though someone unseen was walking down. After that first night, Alex barely left his room. Despite the unnerving atmosphere, he couldn't stop writing. The pages began to fill with ideas he couldn't recall ever thinking about. His dreams became disturbingly vivid, blurring the line between sleep and reality. In one, he was trapped in a pitch-black room, watched by a shadowy figure from the corner. The familiar whisper echoed, "This soul belongs to us. You can never escape." When he woke, the pages on his desk were covered in chaotic sentences, written in his handwriting but seemingly not from his mind, hidden documents tucked away. Determined to uncover the truth, Alex began researching the house's history. He discovered in an old bookshelf. The moldy pages told of a family that had been brutally murdered in the house centuries ago. A malevolent spirit was said to linger, tying itself to anyone who entered. At the end of the documents, a faded portrait fell out. The woman in the painting stared directly at Alex, her eyes filled with a haunting intensity, as though a centuries-old curse had already claimed him. In his final days at the house, Alex realized he was no longer himself. He began hearing whispers during the day, and the words on his pages transformed into clear, ominous curses. "It's time for you to join us." On the last night, Alex dreamed of standing before the house, surrounded by shadowy faces emerging from the darkness. As he turned, the door to the house swung open, revealing an otherworldly realm inside. Spirits surged toward him, their hollow eyes intent on consuming him. When Alex woke, he found himself at his desk, a completed book lying beside him. His name was on the cover, but he couldn't remember finishing it. A knock echoed through the room once more. This time, Alex slowly opened the door. Standing there was the woman from the portrait, her deep, hollow eyes meeting his, and a chilling smile curling her lips. The door slammed shut. Alex was never seen again. The house remains, waiting for its next visitor.